Charles Whitmore barely glanced at the negatives before he pushed the box back across the polished table toward the young man who had carried it in. "Unknown people in unknown rooms," he said in the tired, courteous voice of an expert who has said the same thing 1,000 times. "There is no market here. A collector buys a name a face history already recognizes. Nobody pays for strangers." Jordan Ellis, 18 years old, reached to close the box, and as the lid came down, his eye caught on one frame. He had pulled to the top, a man standing in a doorway, and then it caught on the large oil painting hanging on the wall behind Whitmore's desk. The portrait of the celebrated labor leader. The auction house liked to display the famous face every schoolchild in the county had seen. Jordan looked from the small negative to the big painting and back, and the breath went out of him because the man in the doorway and the man in the painting had the same face. In that instant, Jordan understood that the box the expert had just called worthless might hold a single photograph capable of correcting something. History had gotten wrong for almost 100 years, and that no one but him was ever going to look closely enough to see it. This story is not history. No real leader, no real strike, no real photograph is meant. But the way it moves is true to how memory actually works, and how easily a single cropped image can turn a man into the opposite of what he was. To understand the box on Whitmore's table, you have to go back a few weeks to a house about to be lost. The house belonged on paper to Jordan's Aunt Renee, a librarian who had raised him after his mother could not, a patient woman who smelled of book glue and strong coffee, and who believed with a librarian's faith that everything mattered if you kept it long enough. The house had been in the Ellis family for 3 generations, and now the family was about to lose it because the property taxes had gone unpaid through a stretch of hard years, and the county had set a deadline. Renee had done the math a dozen ways, and it never came out right. So they were doing the thing families do when a house has to go sorting a lifetime of possessions into piles keep and sell and throw away, deciding what a family's past was worth by the pound. It was in that sorting in the sealed heat of the attic that Jordan found the negatives. Not a few, thousands. Box after box of them, glassine sleeves and metal film cans and cardboard folders, all made by a man Jordan had known only as a name and a face in one framed portrait downstairs, his great-grandfather Thomas Ellis. Thomas had been, the family always said vaguely, a picture taker, a man who photographed the community, and the family had kept his things out of the loyalty that keeps such things without ever really looking at them. Jordan looked. He held the negatives up to the bare attic bulb, and a whole vanished world came alive in reverse, dark where it should be light. Barbershops full of men, mid-laugh churches on Sunday, railroad workers leaning on their tools, weddings, kitchens crowded with women, and steam meeting halls full of people leaning forward to listen. It was ordinary black community life across decades, an entire people photographing itself with love and attention by a man who had clearly never stopped working. Jordan sat down on the dusty attic floor and could not stop. Each sleeve he lifted was another window, a christening the baby's gown, a blaze of white against the dark suits, a baseball team squinting into the sun, 2 old men playing checkers on a barrel, a schoolteacher at a blackboard with the chalk letters just legible in reverse. These were not posed studio portraits made for money. They were made by someone who lived among these people, who was trusted enough to be in the kitchen and the back room and the meeting hall. Someone the community had let close. Thomas had photographed the funerals and the weddings, the work and the worship, the whole ordinary sacred texture of lives that no museum had ever thought to collect. And he had done it for no reward that Jordan could see, because the boxes had simply been stored, never sold, never shown, a life's devotion, folded into an attic and forgotten. Jordan felt sitting there the particular grief of realizing how much love can be poured into work that the world never once looks at. Thomas Ellis had died before Jordan was born, and the family spoke of him rarely and thinly the way families speak of ancestors who left no money and no fame. He had worked some ordinary job to live and taken pictures because he could not take them. And when he died, his cameras and his boxes had passed down the generations as a kind of respectful burden kept out of loyalty rather than understanding. No one had ever cracked his system or cataloged his work, partly because it was overwhelming, and partly because everyone assumed, as Whitmore would later say out loud, that pictures of ordinary people held nothing anyone would want. It had taken 3 generations for the family to produce someone with both the eye and the reason to finally look, and it was only the threat of losing the house, the thing that put the boxes on the sorting pile, that had put them in front of Jordan at all. If the taxes had been paid, the archive might have stayed sealed in the attic another 50 years. Jordan was the right person to find them, though he did not know it yet. He worked at a photo lab, one of the last in the area that still developed film, and he had a quality that the job rewarded and that had rarely gotten him anything else: patience and an eye for detail, the ability to look at an image longer and closer than other people bothered to. Where someone else saw an old picture, Jordan saw a sign in a shop window, a date on a calendar, on a wall, the particular way a man held his hat. At the lab, he was the one customers asked for when a roll came back from a wedding or a funeral and something looked wrong, because he could stand at the light table and find in a strip of 36 frames the single one where the flash had failed or the eyes had closed, and he could often say why. His co-workers found his slowness maddening and his results uncanny. I was quiet and observant and a little lonely. The kind of young person who notices everything and is noticed by few, who had learned to find company in details, because people had not always been kind. It was not a glamorous gift, and it had never won him anything. His great-grandfather's archive. It would turn out had been waiting 3 generations for exactly that kind of attention for a descendant who could look at a stranger's face for an hour without getting bored, and who believed without being able to say why that the looking was worth something. The problem was that almost none of the photographs had names. Thomas had labeled them, but not with the names of the people in them. Instead, each sleeve carried a code, a string of numbers and letters, a date, a street, a sequence marker, a private system whose meaning had died with the man who invented it. Thousands of faces and hardly a name among them. To the auction house, that was the whole problem. Renee, desperate and practical, had taken a selection to Whitmore's firm, hoping the archive might be worth enough to save the house. And Whitmore had appraised the one thing he understood: Thomas's camera, a beautiful old Rolleiflex, which had genuine collector value as an object. The negatives he waved away. Photographs of unknown people, he explained, have essentially no resale value because the market for photography is a market for names and recognized events and a picture of a stranger. However, fine is a picture of a stranger. He was not being cruel. He was being accurate about his market, and that accuracy was its own kind of blindness. Whitmore had spent 40 years learning what collectors would pay for, and everything in that training told him the same thing: value follows fame. A photograph of a president is worth a fortune. A technically identical photograph of the man who shined the president's shoes is worth, in the market's cold accounting, nothing at all, even if it is the better picture. Whitmore had internalized that arithmetic so completely that he no longer saw it as a choice. He genuinely could not perceive the archive's worth because his entire profession was built on a definition of worth that had no room for it. That was the deeper thing Jordan was up against, not one arrogant man, but a whole way of assigning value that had quietly decided, long before Jordan walked in, that certain lives were not worth preserving. Whitmore was only its voice that afternoon. He softened it, as men like him do, with a gesture toward generosity. The Rolleiflex, he told Renee, was worth a fair sum, and he could facilitate its sale to a collector of fine cameras, which might help with whatever the family needed. He said it kindly, and it was even true. But Jordan noticed that the offer valued the tool that made the images and dismissed the images themselves, and something about that inversion lodged in him like a splinter. A camera was worth money because a collector wanted the object. 7,000 human faces were worth nothing because no collector wanted the strangers. It was when you looked straight at it, a strange and terrible way to weigh a life's work, and Jordan could not stop looking straight at it. Because Jordan, going through the archive frame by frame in the weeks that followed, had found a sequence that made his hands go cold. It was a set of photographs clearly taken in one session that appeared to document a secret meeting, men and women gathered in a hall. Tense, organized the body language of people doing something forbidden. And in that sequence was a face. Jordan recognized the same face from the painting on Whitmore's wall. A man. The county's official history remembered as a traitor. The organizer who had supposedly sold out a famous strike, betrayed the workers, led the authorities to them. Every child in the county learned his name as a byword for treachery. But in Thomas's photographs, this man was not leading anyone to anything. He was standing at the entrance of the meeting turned toward the workers, and in his hand was a paper, and his posture was the posture of a man giving a warning, not springing a trap. If the sequence was genuine, and if it meant what it seemed to mean, then the accepted story, the entire moral of a chapter of local history, might have been built on a single misleading photograph, one frame cropped and captioned to say the opposite of the truth. Jordan understood immediately how fragile this was, and how easy to get wrong, and it is to his enormous credit that he did not run to anyone shouting that he had overturned history. One photograph, he knew, proves almost nothing. A single frame is a single instant torn out of time, and a single instant can be made to lie precisely because it shows only a moment and hides everything before and after. The man in the doorway could be warning the workers, or could be doing a dozen other things that happened to look like warning for 1/400th of a second. What Jordan had was not an answer. It was a question urgent enough to be worth an enormous amount of careful patient work, the exact kind of work the market had just declared worthless. He decided he would at least digitize the archive before the house was sold and the boxes scattered or thrown away, so that whatever was in them would survive even if he never proved a thing. That decision ran him straight into the physical reality of old film, which does not wait politely to be saved. Many of the rolls were suffering from what preservationists call vinegar syndrome, old acetate film, breaking down chemically, giving off a sharp vinegar smell, curling and buckling and eventually destroying the image as it decays. Others had mold water stains, dust ground into the emulsion, or had curled so tightly they cracked when handled. Jordan started scanning the least damaged negatives on the outdated equipment at the lab, working after hours with the manager's grudging permission. But he quickly realized he was out of his depth, that his eagerness to see the images could easily destroy them. A negative that had survived 70 years can be ruined in a second by a careless hand or the wrong solvent. Help came in the form of Maya Chen, a young preservation specialist Jordan reached through the lab, who agreed to look at what he had. Maya was blunt about the danger. "Every time you unroll one of these, you're spending something you can't get back," she told him. "The emulsion is gelatin. It's basically old skin. You flex it wrong, you lose the picture forever, and there's no second copy." She taught him how to relax curled film safely in a humidity chamber, how to handle negatives by the edges with clean cotton, how to tell which rolls were stable and which were too far gone to open without specialized work. She taught him above all patience of a kind even he had not known he possessed. That preservation is a discipline of restraint, of not doing the tempting thing quickly. The scanning itself became a nightly ritual. After the lab closed, Jordan would stay under the fluorescent lights with a soft brush and a bulb blower and the old scanner, cleaning each negative of decades of dust, easing it flat, capturing it at the highest resolution the equipment could manage, and then returning it to a fresh archival sleeve. He learned to read the health of a roll by its smell before he even opened it, the sharp vinegar tang that meant the acetate was dying, the musty note that meant mold. He triaged the way a nurse triages, scanning the most endangered rolls first, because some of them would not survive another year, and the digital copy might soon be the only version that existed. It was slow, and his eyes ached, and the manager grumbled about the electricity. But frame by frame, a hidden world came into the light, and Jordan began to feel less like he was saving old pictures, and more like he was pulling people out of a burning building one at a time, deciding by the smell of the film who had to be carried out first. Under Maya's guidance, the digitization slowed down and got real, and Jordan began to build one careful scan at a time, a stable record of his great-grandfather's world. He needed a historian too, and he found one in Dr. Evelyn Price, a scholar researching the region's labor movement of that era. Dr. Price was intrigued by Jordan's find, genuinely professionally intrigued, but she was also rigorous in a way that frustrated and then educated him. She would not, she said, draw any conclusion from the photographs without provenance, proof of who took them, when and where, an unbroken chain, establishing that they were what they appeared to be, and had not been staged, mislabeled, or assembled after the fact. "A photograph is not proof by itself," she told him. "It's a claim, and an extraordinary claim that the accepted history is wrong needs more than one striking image. It needs context you can defend." She was not dismissing him like Whitmore had. She was holding him to a standard, and Jordan, who had spent his life being underestimated, found that being taken seriously enough to be held to a standard was its own kind of respect. Dr. Price also gave him something more valuable than encouragement. She gave him the shape of the problem. The received story of the strike, she explained, rested on a single famous newspaper image, the man in the doorway printed once long ago, with a caption that named him a traitor and reprinted so many times since that the caption had hardened into fact. No one had ever questioned it because there had never been anything to question it with. One photograph had built the whole story, and one photograph Dr. Sir. Price warned was exactly what Jordan should be most suspicious of, including his own. If a single frame could convict the man, a single frame could not fully exonerate him either. The truth, if there was one, would have to be assembled from many images and many kinds of evidence, or it would just be one more caption arguing with the old one. That warning became Jordan's whole method. The key to the provenance, it turned out, was the very thing that had made the archive seem worthless. Thomas's codes. Jordan, with his patience and his eye, began to crack them. Working through hundreds of labeled sleeves, comparing them, he realized the codes were not random. They recorded address, time of day, lens exposure, and crucially sequenced the order in which the frames were taken. Thomas had been keeping meticulous technical and locational records the whole time, in a private shorthand, a photographer documenting not just images but the circumstances of each image. Cracking the codes took Jordan the better part of a month, and he did it the way he did everything, by patience and comparison, rather than by any flash of genius. He laid out dozens of sleeves whose contents he could partly identify: a wedding he could date from a newspaper announcement, a storefront he could place from a directory, and he worked backward, treating the codes like a cipher whose plaintext he already partly knew. A recurring 3-digit block turned out to track the street address. He confirmed it by finding 2 frames with the same block that showed the same building from different angles. Another segment tracked the time of day, which he verified against the direction and length of shadows in the photographs themselves. A trailing letter, always incrementing, marked the sequence, the order of exposure. It was, he realized, the record-keeping of a serious craftsman, a man who treated each photograph as a document rather than a snapshot. Once Jordan understood the system, the archive stopped being a pile of anonymous pictures and became something closer to a set of dated, located, sequenced records. He could place a photograph on a specific street at a specific hour. He could put the frames of the meeting in their true order. He could begin, in other words, to reconstruct not just moments, but the flow of events. He cross-referenced everything he could. He compared the storefront signs in the photographs against old business directories, matched the church in one frame to a calendar of services printed in a surviving bulletin, checked a union newsletter against the dates in Thomas's codes, dug through the microfilm of local newspapers. Slowly, the world of the archive knit itself to the documented historical record, each match a small anchor of provenance. And then he found the person no document could replace. Odessa. Green was 94 years old, the last living person who had been an adult in that community when Thomas was photographing it. Jordan was put in touch with her through the church, whose services he had matched to the calendar, and he brought her prints of the scanned images, and the effect on the old woman was like watching a lamp come on in a dark room. She knew them. She put names to faces that had been anonymous for a lifetime. This is my cousin. This is the man who ran the pharmacy. This is the woman who taught the children their letters. And when Jordan showed her the meeting sequence, Odessa went very still, and then she told him what she remembered, that there had been a meeting, that the police had broken it up, and that the man everyone later called a traitor had been no such thing. He came to warn us, she said, her voice steady. He'd heard the police were coming. He stood in that doorway and told us to scatter, and he had the list of what we were asking for, the wages, the safety, all of it right in his hand. They caught him there and turned it around, said he brought the police instead of trying to send us away from them. She looked at Jordan. I have carried that in my chest for 70 years and never had a way to prove it. And here you come with my whole life in a box. The visits with Odessa became the heart of the work, and Jordan came to look forward to them more than to any breakthrough with the codes. He would bring a stack of fresh prints and sit at her kitchen table while she went through them slowly, her thin fingers hovering over each face, and the names would come sometimes at once, sometimes surfacing after a long silence, sometimes with a story attached that turned a stranger into a whole person. This man lost 3 fingers on the railroad and still played the piano at church. This girl married a soldier and moved north and sent letters for years. Jordan wrote every name down, dated, and attributed to Odessa building the thing the archive had never had a key. He understood that he was racing something crueler than the tax deadline. Odessa was 94. She was the last bridge between the faces and their names. And when she was gone, that bridge would be gone, and thousands of people would slide back into being unknown. Not because they were unknowable, but because the one person who still knew them had run out of time. Every afternoon at her table was a rescue. Odessa told him something else, something that reframed the entire archive. She explained that Thomas had deliberately photographed events in sequences, many frames of one occasion, precisely because he had learned the hard way that a newspaper could take a single photograph and change its whole meaning by publishing just that one frame with a caption of its choosing. Thomas had understood that a single image is a weapon that can be turned either way, and so he armed his community with context. He made sure that for every important moment there existed a run of photographs showing what came before and after, so that no one frame could be lifted out and made to lie. He had been in his quiet way defending the truth against the crop, and the traitor story was exactly what he had feared one frame isolated, captioned to accuse. Word of Jordan's research reached Whitmore, and the auction specialist did a very human thing. Having called the negatives worthless, he now offered to buy the entire archive for a small sum, all of it outright. The offer was a tell. You do not offer money for a box of nothing. Whitmore had heard enough to suspect the archive might have historical significance after all, and his instinct, the instinct of his whole world, was to acquire it, to control it, to be the one who owned and eventually sold the important thing. And the offer landed at the worst possible moment, because the property tax deadline was closing in, and the small sum Whitmore offered was real money against a real debt, and Renee, exhausted, had to seriously consider selling her grandfather's life's work to the man who had dismissed it in order to keep the house that held it. The argument between Jordan and his aunt over that offer was quiet and painful, because they loved each other and wanted the same two things that could not both be had. Renee had raised him. She had given up a great deal to keep him, and now she was being asked at the end of a long fight to choose between the house that was their whole security and a box of negatives whose value was still only a hope in her great-nephew's eyes. "I believe you," she told him, and she meant it. "But belief doesn't pay the county. If I turn this down and you're wrong, or even if you're right but too slow, we lose the house and the pictures both, and then what was it all for?" Jordan did not have a clean answer. He only knew in a way he could not fully defend that selling the archive to Whitmore would be handing the memory of a whole community to a man who would break it into marketable pieces the moment it became convenient, and that some things once scattered could never be gathered again. He asked her for a little more time. It was, he knew, an unfair thing to ask, and he asked it anyway, and she gave it, because that is what she had always done. It was here that Jordan restored the central image, the one everything turned on, and the midpoint of the whole search arrived. Working with Maya carefully over days, he digitized and cleaned the keyframe of the meeting sequence. And there it was, no longer a suggestion, but a clear image. The supposed traitor was not leading police into the hall. I was standing at the entrance. His body turned toward the workers, warning them, and in his raised hand he held a list. The workers' own demands for wages and safety. The very document, the official story claimed, proved his betrayal, held not as evidence against them, but as the thing he had been fighting for. It was in that single restored frame exactly what Odessa had described. Jordan sat and looked at it for a long time. But he did not let himself believe it was enough, because he could hear Dr. Price in his head. One photograph, however clear, still cannot establish what happened before and after. A skeptic could still argue about that one frozen instant. To make the truth undeniable, he needed the sequence, the frames on either side, the very context Thomas had so carefully created, and that time and decay had scattered. So began a race that was really a test of character. Jordan searched the archive for every frame taken before and after the famous moment, matching Thomas's sequence codes, hunting the run of images that would lock the meaning in place. And as he assembled them, he confirmed what Odessa had told him. Thomas had deliberately overlapped his scenes, each photograph sharing a little of the frame before it, so that the sequence could be proven continuous, so that no one could claim a picture had been slipped in from another day. But the single most important roll, the one that should contain the frames immediately around the arrest, was in terrible condition. It had fused the film welded to itself by heat and time and decay, and across its outer wrapper in Thomas's own hand were the words, "Do not print." Jordan was tempted, and the temptation is the moral center of the whole story. He could try to separate that fused roll himself quickly before the tax deadline, and if it held the frames he needed, he might be able to prove everything in time to attract the kind of attention that could save the house. But Maya had taught him what a fused roll was: film that would tear and destroy itself if forced apart by anyone without the right equipment and training. To rush it was to risk annihilating the single most important piece of evidence forever, to lose the truth in the act of grabbing for it. He sat with that fused roll in his hands for a long time one night at the lab, turning it over, reading "Do not print" in his great-grandfather's faded ink. I understood now why Thomas had written it, not because the roll was dangerous, but because the images on it were the most important and the most fragile, the frames of the truth actually being seized, and Thomas had known they must never be rushed, never printed carelessly, never handled by anyone who did not understand what they held. The warning was a message across 70 years, from one careful man to whoever came next, and Jordan realized that he was the whoever, that the entire archive had been a letter waiting for a reader patient enough to obey its instructions. To force the roll apart himself now would be to ignore the one explicit thing his great-grandfather had ever asked of him. He chose preservation over speed. He chose to send the fused roll to be restored properly slowly by experts, even though the proper way would take longer than the tax deadline allowed, even though it meant he might save the truth and lose the house in the same decision. It was the hardest thing he did, and he did it because his great-grandfather had spent a lifetime protecting context against the quick, convenient crop, and Jordan was not going to dishonor that by becoming at the last moment the impatient hand that destroyed what he was trying to save. The house was not saved by a miracle, and the story would be lying if it pretended otherwise. It was saved partway by a community. As word of what Jordan had found spread through the church and the neighborhood, people who had almost nothing gave what they could. Small amounts that added up enough to buy an extension on the tax deadline, not enough to erase the debt, but enough to hold the wolf at the door a little longer enough to buy the time the fused roll needed. The fundraising was a humbling thing to watch. It was not one large gift from one wealthy patron. It was a church collection plate passed twice ajar on the counter at the barber shop that appeared in one of Thomas's own photographs. $20 from a woman on a fixed income who had recognized her late husband in one of the scanned frames, a bake sale organized by teenagers who had never met Thomas Ellis and never would. Renee, who had spent months feeling like a failure for not being able to save the house, alone, had to learn to accept help, which for a proud woman is harder than giving it. Each contribution came with a message, and the messages were almost identical. Keep them. Whatever those pictures are, keep them, because they are us. It was not the auction house's money that kept the family in the house. It was the descendants of the very people in Thomas's photographs, protecting the record of their own past, refusing to let it be priced at nothing and carried away. Whitmore, watching from his world of markets and provenance, did what a self-protective expert does when an amateur threatens to be right. He publicly cast doubt. He let it be known that the young man's interpretation was unverified, that a single photograph proved nothing, that extraordinary historical claims required more than a hopeful family's reading of old negatives. And he was in the narrow sense not wrong, which was exactly why Jordan had refused to rely on one photograph. The case Jordan and Dr. Price were building was not one image. Dr. Price, following the provenance Jordan had established, located a police record from the period, an arrest log matching the date, time, and location that Thomas's codes had assigned to the meeting sequence. Independent official confirmation that the event had happened when and where the photographs said it had. Odessa. Understanding. She was the last voice who could do it. Recorded a formal oral history statement identifying the people in the frames and describing the meeting and the warning, her testimony preserved properly this time with her full name attached. And at last, the fused roll came back from restoration, painstakingly separated by the experts. Jordan had trusted it to, and it held what he had prayed. It held the frames around the arrest, showing the police confiscating the workers' documents, and Thomas still there, still photographing, refusing to stop. Even as it happened, documenting the very act of the truth being seized. The reckoning came at a public appraisal and historical review, the kind of event where an archive's fate and meaning get decided in a room full of officials and scholars and cameras. Whitmore was there, and near the end he turned to Jordan with a question that was really a challenge, the question of his entire worldview. So, how much do you believe these photographs are worth? He expected a number, or an amateur's fumbling, or a claim he could puncture. Jordan did not give him any of those. "You're still asking the wrong question," Jordan said, and his voice did not shake. "It was never about what they're worth. It's about who gets to own the memory of the people inside them." And then calmly, he laid it all out, the complete photographic sequence in its proven order, Thomas's codes, translated the police record. Dr. Price had found Odessa's recorded testimony, the restored final roll. Not one striking image, but a chain of evidence overlapping and mutually reinforcing, exactly as Thomas had designed it to be, a case built so that no single frame could be pulled out and made to lie. The room changed as he spoke, and Jordan felt it change. He did not raise his voice or perform outrage. He simply walked the officials and scholars through the chain, the way he had built it. One anchored link at a time, and each link made the next harder to dismiss. When he played Odessa's recorded voice describing the doorway and the warning, and then showed the restored frame that matched her words exactly, and then set beside it the police log that Dr. Price had pulled independently from the county's own records, confirming the date and the hour the case stopped being a young man's hopeful reading and became something a serious person could no longer wave away. Whitmore's earlier objection that a single image proved nothing had been true, and Jordan had answered it not by arguing, but by refusing to rely on a single image at all. Together, the pieces did what a single photograph never could. They restored the truth of what had happened, and they restored the names and the honor of people the official record had erased or accused. The man history had called a traitor was on the strength of that evidence, publicly reconsidered and cleared his memory, corrected almost a century late. And Whitmore did not lose his career, and no one made him grovel, because that is not how these things actually resolve, and the story is not interested in that fantasy. His comeuppance was smaller and more exact. He had to stand in that room while the archive he had called worthless was recognized as significant, while a young man he had dismissed was proven patient and right, and while the whole logic of his profession, that value lives in famous names and nothing else, was quietly publicly refuted. He had appraised a box of history and priced it at nothing, and now everyone had watched him be wrong about the only thing that mattered. To his small credit, when it was over, Whitmore did not storm out. He stood for a moment in front of the assembled sequence. The images he had refused to look at closely, and something crossed his face that might have been the beginning of understanding the recognition. Perhaps that his whole life's expertise had trained him to see everything about a photograph except the person inside it. He did not apologize, and Jordan did not need him to. The correction of the record was the only apology that meant anything, and it did not belong to Whitmore to give. What happened to the archive is the part that matters most. A university stepped in to fund the professional conservation and digitization of the entire collection, but the ownership did not pass to the university, and it did not become Jordan's private fortune. It was placed under a community trust, held by and for the descendants of the people in the photographs, so that the memory could never again be bought, sold, cropped, or controlled by an outsider, deciding what a stranger's face was worth. The family house, the one that had almost been lost, became a small archive and research center. The boxes from the attic returning to the rooms they had waited in, now cataloged and cared for, and open to the community. School groups began to visit. Descendants came looking for their grandparents and found them named at last on labels beneath the prints, and some of them wept in the front room where Thomas had once loaded his camera. Renee ran it, of course. A librarian had turned out to be exactly the right keeper for an archive, and the work gave her back something the long fight over the taxes had nearly taken. Thomas Ellis's photographs came home, and the home became the place where a community could go to remember itself on purpose. Jordan did one more thing, and it was the truest ending the story could have. His great-grandfather's Rolleiflex. The beautiful old camera Whitmore had been so eager to appraise could have gone behind museum glass as the valuable object of the collection. Jordan repaired it instead. He learned to fix it, coaxed the old mechanism back to working life, and then he loaded it with film and went to see Odessa Green, 94 years old, the woman who had given names to a lifetime of anonymous faces. He asked to take her portrait, and she sat for him in her good dress with her hands folded, and he made her picture with the same camera his great-grandfather had used to photograph her community 70 years before. And when he developed it, he did the thing Thomas's whole archive had been missing, the thing that had nearly cost the truth everything. He labeled the photograph immediately fully, in plain writing on the back, her full name, Odessa Green, the date, the location, and a few lines of her story. No code, no mystery, no stranger in an unknown room, just a named woman remembered on purpose so that no one ever would have to spend 70 years proving who she was. Here's what stays with me about a story like this one. We use the word unknown as if it were a fact about a person, an unknown soldier, an unknown face, unknown people in unknown rooms. But unknown is almost never a fact about the person. It is a fact about us, about what we did not preserve, whose names we did not bother to write down, which lives we decided in advance were not worth the labor of remembering. Every anonymous face in an old photograph was known perfectly well by someone, was a whole person with a name and a warning and a list of demands held in one hand. They become unknown only when no one is patient enough to ask, and they can be made known again the moment someone is. History is not only what happened, it is what we chose to keep and who we chose to keep it for. So let me ask you something, and I hope you'll answer in the comments. Is there someone in your own family's photographs? A face without a name? A story no one wrote down that you still have time to identify and preserve before the last person who remembers them is gone? If this story meant something to you, please take a moment to subscribe, because every week we tell another story about ordinary people who refuse to let the truth be called worthless, and I would love for you to be here for the next one.